I stood at the living room window, watching the detective take a statement from the neighbor across the street. It was the third break-in on Elm Street in a month, and now the thieves had gotten into Patricia Morris's house. She had lived in the neighborhood for 70 years and never thought she would have to lock her doors with 3 locks and be afraid of her own shadow. Buffalo had always seemed like a quiet city to me, especially our neighborhood with its neat houses and trimmed lawns. Now every creak made me jump. Patricia was waving her arms, explaining something to the police officer. Poor thing, she must still be in shock. Last night she went to her daughter's for dinner, and when she returned around 10, she found a broken window in the kitchen and the house ransacked. They stole the TV, her laptop, and some money she kept in a box on the dresser. It could have been worse, but it was still unpleasant. At our age, every shock is hard to take. The first burglary happened 3 weeks ago at Hugo Foster's house, the one with the green shutters on the corner. Hugo is 82 and has hardly left the house since his heart attack last winter. The thieves broke in through the back door while he was asleep and took his grandfather's antique clock, his coin collection, and cash from the safe. Hugo was unable to recover for 2 weeks, repeating that nothing like this had ever happened in the 60 years he had lived in this house. Mildred Johnson was robbed for the second time 2 weeks ago. She is 78 and has been living alone since her husband died 5 years ago. Mildred's wedding ring, which she had taken off before going to bed and left on her bedside table, her silverware, and her utility bills were stolen. After that incident, she moved in with her son in Rochester, saying she no longer felt safe in her own home. I walked away from the window and headed to the kitchen to make some tea. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from arthritis, which was becoming more and more noticeable. Dr. Wilson said it was normal for my age, but I didn't like feeling helpless, especially now when there was so much going on around me. Over the past few days, I had caught myself listening to every sound, checking the locks 3 times before going to bed, and waking up at the slightest rustle. Just last night, I had spent a long time researching security companies on the internet. Jacob always laughed at my reluctance to learn modern technology, saying that I was stuck in the last century. But in recent years, I've realized that it's really difficult without a computer and the internet. My pension is small, so every purchase requires comparing prices and looking for discounts. And now security has become a problem too. I browse the websites of security companies, comparing prices and features. A full system with sensors on all doors and windows cost more than $2,000, which was beyond my means. But a simple camera for one room cost $300, including installation. It was a significant amount for my budget, but peace of mind is priceless. The doorbell made me freeze with the kettle in my hands. I cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. A young man in a security company uniform was standing on the doorstep with a large box in his hands. The Buffalo Shield Company logo was emblazoned on the side of the box. Michelle Harrington, delivery of the video surveillance system you ordered yesterday. I opened the door, checking that the chain was in place, and let him into the house. The installer turned out to be a pleasant young man in his 30s who introduced himself as Tyler. He quickly surveyed the living room, assessing possible locations for the camera. I recommend here, in the corner near the bookcase, he said, pointing to a spot above an antique dresser. You'll get maximum coverage, the entrance, the sofa, the coffee table, part of the kitchen through the archway, and the camera will be virtually invisible to guests. Is it difficult to operate? I asked. I'm not very familiar with modern technology. No, it's simple. It records to a memory card, and you can watch it on your phone or tablet. It sends a notification when it detects movement. I'll show you how to use it. While Tyler was working, I made some tea and settled into my favorite chair with a book. I couldn't read. My thoughts kept returning to the recent events. The thieves had definitely studied our neighborhood and figured out where elderly people lived who might keep cash or valuables at home. All three robberies took place on weekdays when people were either asleep or away from home. The criminals acted professionally, quickly, and quietly. I thought about my valuables. I never take off my wedding ring, and my late mother's earrings and bracelet are in a bank deposit box. At home, I only keep family photos, old documents, and a little cash for unexpected expenses. But even the loss of these things would be painful, not so much materially as emotionally. It's ready, Tyler announced an hour later. Now I'll show you how to operate the system. He took out his tablet and demonstrated the interface. The camera was indeed almost invisible, a small black dot in the corner under the ceiling that could easily be mistaken for a smoke detector. The image was transmitted in high quality, and the sound was recorded clearly. On the screen, I could see the entire living room as if it were in the palm of my hand. It records continuously, Tyler explained, but the system is smart. It responds to movement and sound. If someone enters the room, you will receive a notification on your phone within 30 seconds. You can see what's happening right away or watch the recording later. He showed me how to switch between live and archived footage, how to save important clips, and how to adjust the motion sensor's sensitivity. It turned out to be not as difficult as I had feared. The main thing was to take my time and follow the instructions. If you have any questions, call the 24-hour number in the manual, Tyler said, gathering his tools. And remember, the camera records everything that happens in the room. Warn your guests if you think it's necessary. Although, by law, you have the right to video surveillance in your own home without the consent of visitors. After he left, I spent half an hour studying all the features of the system. I walked around the room, waved my arms, said something. Everything was clearly recorded. The image quality was much better than I expected. Even in the evening lighting, it was possible to distinguish faces and small details. The infrared backlight turned on automatically in the dark. I had mixed feelings. On the one hand, the camera gave me a sense of security. Now anyone who tried to break into the house would be caught on video. On the other hand, it was a little unsettling to know that my every move in the living room was being recorded. I would have to get used to not walking around in my bathrobe in the morning and watching my appearance. Around 6 in the evening, Jacob called. "Hi, Mom. How are you? I heard the news about your neighborhood. Was someone robbed again?" "Yes, this morning. Patricia Morris. Do you remember her? She lives across the street and has such a beautiful pink garden." "I remember. Wow. Are you okay?" "Of course. In fact, I installed a video surveillance system today." "Really?" Jacob was surprised. "Mom, that must have been expensive." $300 with installation. Not too much for peace of mind and security. "Well, yes, of course, you did the right thing. Listen, Brittany and I are planning to stop by tomorrow evening to see what kind of high-tech gadget you have there." "Great, I'll be happy to see you. I'll bake your favorite apple pie with cinnamon." "Great, we'll be there around 7 if that's okay with you." "Of course, I'll be waiting for you." After the conversation, I felt a surge of good cheer. I hadn't seen the kids in a long time. The last time they came was a month ago. Jacob had always been a caring son, calling regularly and taking an interest in my affairs. Brittany seemed a little cold at first, but over time our relationship improved. Or so I thought. In the evening, I carefully studied the camera instructions again and practiced using the mobile app. The system worked flawlessly, responding to every movement. When I walked through the living room, a notification instantly popped up on my phone. I had to lower the sensitivity, otherwise the constant alerts were driving me crazy. Before going to bed, I carefully checked all the locks and turned on the alarm on the front door. The camera blinked quietly with a red light in the corner, keeping its invisible guard. It was strange to think that now, Even my nightly trip to the kitchen for water would be recorded, but that's a small price to pay for a sense of security. Outside the window, darkness fell, and Elm Street was enveloped in silence. A few streetlights were on, and some houses still had lights in the windows. Neighbors were watching TV or reading before bed. Outwardly, everything looked peaceful and quiet, as always in our quiet neighborhood. But now I knew that this visible safety was deceptive. Somewhere nearby, people could be hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As I fell asleep, I thought about how life had changed in recent years. Robert and I never used to lock our doors during the day. We left our keys in the car, and we weren't afraid to open the door to strangers. Now I have to be cautious, distrustful, constantly on guard. Perhaps the world hasn't become more dangerous. I've just become more vulnerable. A lonely elderly woman in a big house is an easy target for criminals. But now I have an electronic guard that stays awake at night and won't miss a single suspicious movement. This gave me a certain peace of mind, allowing me to relax and fall asleep without worrying about possible danger. The next day, I woke up with an unusual feeling of security. The first thing I did was check my phone. The camera had worked well throughout the night, recording only my brief appearance in the living room around 3 in the morning when I went to the kitchen for water. The image was clear even in the dark thanks to the infrared lighting. Technology has really come a long way in recent years. The morning began with the usual routine: breakfast, watching the news, watering the flowers on the windowsill. The TV was showing a story about the rise in crime in the suburbs of large cities. Crime reports have become an integral part of the daily news, which seemed unthinkable before. The newsreader, with a serious expression on his face, talked about ways to protect against burglaries, recommending that elderly people not open the door to strangers and install alarm systems. Around 11 in the morning, I went to the grocery store to buy food for dinner. I needed to buy apples for a pie, fresh meat, and vegetables. Jacob loved to eat heartily, especially my home cooking. Brittany followed various diets, but usually didn't refuse dessert. Although lately I had noticed that she had become more picky about food, often asking about the ingredients and calorie content of dishes. At the store, I ran into my neighbor, Dorothy Wilson, who lived 3 houses down from me. Dorothy is 74 years old and moved to our neighborhood 10 years ago after her husband passed away. We often chatted over the fence about gardening and local news. "Michelle, how are you? I heard about Patricia. What a terrible story," Dorothy said, picking out tomatoes. "Now I'm afraid to stay home alone." "I understand you. Yesterday I installed a surveillance camera. At least it's some kind of protection." "Smart move. I'm thinking of moving in with my son in Syracuse. I don't feel safe here anymore. In 30 years of living in Buffalo, nothing like this has ever happened." We talked for a few more minutes about current events in the neighborhood. Dorothy said she saw a suspicious car driving slowly through our streets the night before last. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, but she couldn't make out the license plate number. Perhaps it was the same robbers looking for new targets to attack. When I got home, I started cooking. The apple pie took time. I had to carefully peel and slice the fruit, prepare the dough, and let it rest. It was my mother's recipe, which I had learned when I was young. Jacob had loved this pie since childhood, especially when I added cinnamon and a little nutmeg. While the dough was resting in the refrigerator, I started cleaning. I wanted the house to look perfect for the children's visit. I dusted the living room, vacuumed the carpet, and arranged fresh flowers from the garden in vases. The camera in the corner almost blended in with the ceiling, but I still glanced at it from time to time. It was strange to realize that my every move was being recorded. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the pie was already baking in the oven, filling the house with the cozy aroma of cinnamon and baked apples. Meat and vegetables were simmering on the stove, another of Jacob's favorite dishes. I set the table in the dining room, took out the best dishes and linen napkins. Family dinners had always been an important event in our home, a tradition I tried to uphold. At exactly 7 o'clock, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Looking out the window, I saw Jacob's familiar blue SUV. My son looked tired after a day at work, but he smiled when he saw me at the window. Brittany got out of the car slowly, typing something on her phone. She was dressed in a strict business suit and looked elegant, as always. "Hi, Mom." Jacob gave me a big hug at the door. "It smells wonderful." "Is that your famous apple pie?" "Of course, and stewed meat with vegetables, just the way you like it." "Hi, Michelle." Brittany greeted me, lightly touching my cheek with hers. Her kiss was formal, without much warmth. "Thanks for inviting us. Your place is very cozy, as always." We went into the living room, where I offered them tea or coffee. Jacob immediately noticed the camera in the corner and became interested in the technical side of the installation. He worked for an insurance company and knew more about security systems than I did. "Not a bad choice, Mom. This model is quite popular, good value for money. Is it easy to control via your phone?" "I'm still figuring it out, but it doesn't seem too complicated. The main thing is that now I'll know if someone tries to break into the house." Brittany listened to our conversation, but seemed distracted. She was looking around the living room with an attentive gaze that, for some reason, seemed too scrutinizing to me. My daughter-in-law had always been observant, but today there was something unusual about her behavior. She was examining the furniture, the paintings on the walls, and the bookshelves with such thoroughness, as if she were assessing the value of the items. "Is the camera recording constantly?" Brittany asked. "Isn't that uncomfortable for you?" I'm slowly getting used to the living room, but it's calmer now. After all these break-ins in the neighborhood, it's better to be safe than sorry. "That's reasonable." She nodded, but I detected a certain tension in her voice. We moved to the dining room, where I served dinner. Jacob enjoyed talking about work, new projects at the company, and vacation plans. He had always been sociable and loved to share news. Brittany, on the other hand, responded in monosyllables when spoken to and spent most of the time silent, focused on her food. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Jacob asked between the main course and dessert. "Is anything bothering you? Maybe you should see a doctor for a checkup." "Everything's fine, son. My arthritis flares up sometimes, but that's just my age. Dr. Wilson says I'm in pretty good shape for my age. You still need to get checked regularly. At our age." Jacob paused, realizing how awkward that sounded. "Well, prevention is important at any age." Brittany looked up from her plate and looked at me intently for the first time that evening. "What medications are you taking? For arthritis, blood pressure? You must have accumulated a whole arsenal of drugs over the years." The question struck me as strange. Brittany had never been interested in the details of my health before. She usually limited herself to general phrases about my well-being without going into detail. "Oh, just a few. Blood pressure pills, vitamins for my bones, nothing special." "Where do you keep them? In the bathroom, probably, in the medicine cabinet, or is the kitchen more convenient?" "In the bedroom, on the bedside table. That way I don't forget to take them in the morning and evening." Jacob didn't pay attention to this conversation. He was busy with his piece of pie and talking about a colleague who had bought a new car. But for some reason, I remembered Brittany's questions and her interest in the topic of medication. After dinner, we returned to the living room to drink tea and eat pie. Jacob praised my baking as always, while Brittany ate only a small piece, citing her diet. She began to examine the room closely again, this time focusing on the documents lying on the coffee table. "What's that, Michelle?" she asked, pointing to the folder with papers. "Something important?" "Documents for the house, insurance, all kinds of certificates. I keep everything in one place so it doesn't get lost." Brittany nodded, but I noticed that she remembered the location of the folder. Her gaze returned to the coffee table several times during the evening. Maybe she was just curious by nature, but something about her behavior was alarming. When I went to the kitchen for more tea, I saw through the archway that Brittany had gotten up and walked over to the bookshelf. She looked at the spines of the books, then shifted her gaze to the photographs on the top shelf. Family photos, photos with Robert, childhood photos of Jacob. But she wasn't so much interested in the photos as in what might be stored behind them. "Brittany, are you looking for something?" I asked, returning with the teapot. "No, just admiring the family photos. You have so many memories here." She quickly sat back down on the sofa, but I noticed that one of the photos was out of place. The photo of our silver wedding anniversary with Robert was slightly turned, although it had been straight in the morning. Perhaps she accidentally knocked it over while looking at it. The evening was coming to an end. Jacob looked at his watch and said it was time to go home. He had to get up early for work tomorrow. Brittany agreed, although she had seemed pensive and distant all evening. As they were about to leave, she asked to use the bathroom. "Of course, dear." "You know where everything is." Brittany headed down the hall to the bathroom, but I heard her go into my bedroom first. The door creaked softly, then I heard cautious footsteps. A minute later, she went into the bathroom, and a few minutes later she returned to the living room. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Yes, of course. I just wanted to see the new curtains in the bedroom that you mentioned last time." I didn't remember saying anything about new curtains. The bedroom had the same curtains as a year ago, but I didn't ask again. Maybe I had forgotten. As he was leaving, Jacob thanked me again for dinner and promised to come by next week. Brittany also expressed her gratitude, but her smile seemed forced. When they left, I stayed in the living room, reflecting on the evening. Something about my sister-in-law's behavior seemed unnatural to me. Too many questions about medications, too much scrutiny of the room, visiting the bedroom under a strange pretext. Maybe I was reading too much into the details, but my maternal instinct told me that something was wrong. I went into the bedroom and carefully examined the bedside table. The medicine boxes were in their places, but one of them had been turned with the label facing the other way. It was a small detail that no one else would have noticed, but I always arranged my medications in strict order. It was easier to remember what to take and when. Returning to the living room, I noticed that the folder with the documents had also been slightly moved. It was only a little, but enough to catch the eye of someone accustomed to order. Could Brittany have been looking through my papers while I was in the kitchen? Why would she need to do that? I sat down in an armchair and tried to analyze the situation rationally. Perhaps my daughter-in-law was just curious by nature. Many people, when left alone in someone else's house, look at the surroundings, photographs, and books. This is normal human behavior, but questions about medications and documents went beyond ordinary curiosity. Before going to bed, I checked the camera again. The system had recorded the entire evening, capturing our movements in the living room. It would be interesting to watch the recording and see if Brittany's behavior really seemed suspicious to me. But it seemed paranoid to spy on my own sister-in-law in my own home. As I fell asleep, I thought that perhaps loneliness and recent events in the neighborhood had made me overly suspicious. Brittany had always been a reserved woman, not prone to openness. Maybe she was just in a bad mood or having problems at work. There was no need to look for a catch where there wasn't one. I woke up the next morning with a heavy head and a strange taste in my mouth. I usually fell asleep easily and woke up feeling refreshed and rested, but today was different. It was as if I had been fighting some kind of illness all night or had taken strong medication. My head was spinning when I sat on the edge of the bed, and my body felt unusually weak. My first thought was to blame my discomfort on yesterday's chores. Cooking, cleaning, excitement before the children's visit. All of this could have affected my well-being. At my age, the body reacts more acutely to any stress than in youth. Dr. Wilson had said more than once that I needed to conserve my energy and not overload myself with household chores. When I got out of bed, I felt slightly dizzy. I had to hold on to the back of a chair to keep my balance. This hadn't happened to me in a long time. Usually, in the morning, I was full of energy, quickly got myself ready, and started doing household chores. Today, every movement was difficult, as if I had the flu. In the bathroom, looking in the mirror, I was surprised to find that I looked pale and haggard. There were dark circles under my eyes that weren't there yesterday. My skin had taken on an unhealthy grayish tint. Even my hair looked dull and lifeless. It was as if I had aged several years overnight. After taking a shower, I felt a little better, but the weakness remained. I went down to the kitchen and made a strong cup of coffee, hoping it would perk me up. Caffeine usually helped me wake up completely, but today even 2 cups didn't have the desired effect. On the contrary, I felt slightly nauseous, which made me skip breakfast. I sat down in an armchair in the living room with a cup of warm tea, trying to understand what could have caused this condition. Last night I felt great, cooking, cleaning, and entertaining guests. Dinner went smoothly, with no unpleasant situations. The pie turned out well, and the meat and vegetables were delicious too. Jacob praised the food, and Brittany ate without comment. The only thing that was different from a normal evening was my daughter-in-law's strange behavior, her close examination of the living room, questions about medications, visiting the bedroom under a false pretext. But it was illogical to connect this with my current indisposition. Perhaps I had indeed overestimated my strength in preparing for the visit. By noon, the weakness had not only not gone away, but had even intensified. I tried to do my usual chores, dusting, watering the flowers, sorting the mail, but every 10 minutes I had to sit down and rest. I hadn't felt this weak in many years. Even when I had the flu last winter, I didn't feel this bad. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my neighbor Dorothy called. She was going to the store and offered to buy something I needed. Normally, I would have politely declined. I didn't like to burden people with my requests. But today, I gratefully accepted. It would be unwise to leave the house in this condition. Michelle, you sound strange, Dorothy remarked. Your voice sounds sluggish. Are you sick? I don't know. I'm not feeling very well. I must have overworked myself yesterday. What was so special about yesterday? The children came over for dinner. I cooked, cleaned, and worried. I see, but still, be careful. There's been so much going on in the neighborhood lately, and stress affects everyone. Maybe you should see a doctor. After talking to Dorothy, I thought about what she said. Indeed, my voice sounded sluggish, and words came with difficulty. It was as if my tongue had become unresponsive, and my thoughts slowed down. Such symptoms could indicate various problems, from a cold to more serious disorders. I tried to remember if I had ever felt this way before, and then it hit me. I had felt exactly the same weakness and sluggishness a month ago, after Jacob and Brittany's previous visit. At the time, I also attributed my malaise to fatigue, thinking that I had overindulged in the refreshments. The symptoms went away after a day or two, and I forgot about the incident. But now that the situation had repeated itself, the coincidence seemed suspicious. Twice in a row after my daughter-in-law's visits, I experienced a strange weakness. Could it be a psychosomatic reaction? Was it stress from interacting with Brittany, who always kept her distance from me? Or was it just a coincidence? I tried to recall the events of a month ago. It was also a family dinner, and I was cooking my son's favorite dishes. Brittany was calm, but somewhat aloof and didn't participate much in the conversation. After they left, I felt the same inexplicable fatigue, which lasted for 2 days. It is curious that during Jacob's other visits, when he came alone, there were no such problems. We spent time talking. I cooked dinner for him, and there were no unpleasant consequences. The discomfort only appeared after meetings with the couple. By evening, my condition had improved slightly, but the weakness did not completely go away. I struggled to make myself a light dinner, oatmeal with honey and herbal tea. I didn't feel like eating at all, but I needed to keep my strength up. My hands trembled slightly while I was eating, which was also unusual. Dorothy brought groceries around 7 in the evening. When she saw me, she frowned with concern. Michelle, you don't look well. Are you sure you don't need to call a doctor? Thank you, but I think I'll be better tomorrow. I just need a good night's sleep. If anything happens, don't hesitate to call. And another thing, I saw that strange car again today. A dark sedan was driving slowly down our street, and the driver seemed to be looking for something. The news about the suspicious car added to the anxiety of an already unpleasant day. It meant that the robbers had not yet left the area and were continuing to look for new targets. It's good that I now have a camera. If they try to break into the house, everything will be recorded. Before going to bed, I checked the video surveillance system. The camera was working properly, recording the empty living room. Yesterday's visit from the children was stored in the device's memory. I could watch any moment of the evening. I became curious. Did the camera record anything unusual in Brittany's behavior? But it seemed strange to watch the recording. After all, she is my daughter-in-law, the mother of my future grandchildren. I shouldn't turn into a paranoid old woman who suspects her relatives of some kind of evil intentions. Perhaps my illness was really due to stress or the onset of a cold. Lying in bed, I tried again to analyze my condition. The symptoms resembled mild poisoning or a reaction to some medication, but I had only taken my usual blood pressure medication and vitamins. Yesterday's food was fresh and made from quality ingredients. I hadn't consumed alcohol for many months. Suddenly, I remembered one important detail. Last night, I drank tea from my favorite rose-patterned cup. Brittany poured it for me in the kitchen while I was cutting the pie into slices. At the time, it seemed like a normal act of courtesy, helping the hostess, but now this episode took on a different meaning. Could someone have spiked my tea? The idea seemed absurd, but it would explain the strange symptoms. Sedatives or sleeping pills in small doses cause exactly these effects: drowsiness, sluggishness, weakness the next day. But why would my sister-in-law poison me? What would be the point? Maybe Brittany had a drug or alcohol problem and accidentally dropped something into my cup. Or was she taking some kind of strong medication, traces of which remained on her hands? Although these explanations seemed far-fetched, I tried to push my suspicions aside and focus on relaxing. Tomorrow I would definitely feel better, and this whole story would seem ridiculous. People my age sometimes experience unexplained ailments. It's a normal part of the aging process. But it was difficult to fall asleep. My head continued to spin, and my body felt unpleasantly heavy. I woke up several times from my own snoring, although I usually slept quietly. My sleep was restless, full of strange dreams that I couldn't remember in the morning. By the morning of the third day, I was indeed feeling better. The weakness had almost gone, my head was clearer, and the feeling of sluggishness had disappeared. I was able to eat breakfast normally and even do the light exercises I had been doing every morning for the past 10 years. But the episode of feeling unwell left an unpleasant feeling in my heart. Two identical incidents after Brittany's visits could not be a mere coincidence. Something was going on, and I needed to figure out the situation. I couldn't figure out what it was yet, but my maternal instinct told me that the danger was real. I decided to be more attentive during family gatherings in the future, not to leave food and drinks unattended, to keep an eye on who was doing what in the kitchen. Perhaps it was excessive caution, but it was better to be safe than to miss something important. On the evening of the third day, I finally recovered and was able to go about my usual business. I weeded the flower beds in the garden, cooked a full dinner, and watched my favorite TV show. But my thoughts kept returning to the strange illness and its possible causes. Before going to bed, I checked the surveillance camera again. The recording from the previous evening was still stored in the device's memory. Maybe I should watch it and make sure my suspicions were unfounded, or would it be better not to dwell on the past and forget about this story? I hadn't made a final decision yet, but my intuition, which had rarely failed me in my 70 years of life, insisted that something was wrong, and sooner or later the truth would inevitably come out. 3 days after my children's visit, I had finally recovered and was able to soberly assess what had happened. The strange malaise did not recur, my strength returned, and my appetite was restored. It would seem that I could forget about the unpleasant episode and chalk it up to overwork or the effects of aging. But a nagging feeling of anxiety did not leave me. On the morning of the fourth day, sitting at breakfast, I replayed the events of that evening over and over again in my head. Every detail, every word, every glance from Brittany took on new meaning in light of my subsequent illness. I especially remembered the moment when she poured me tea in the kitchen while I was dividing the pie among the plates. At the time, it seemed like ordinary politeness on the part of my sister-in-law. She took my favorite rose-patterned cup, poured hot tea from the teapot, and carefully placed it on the tray. I was busy with dessert and just thanked her for her help. But now this episode was seen in a completely different light. After breakfast, I sat in the living room for a long time, looking at the small black dot of the camera in the corner. The video surveillance system had been faithfully recording everything that had been happening for almost a week. The device's memory stored hours of footage, including the entire recording of the evening when the children visited. One click on the phone screen, and I could see everything with my own eyes. But something was holding me back from taking that step. Watching recordings of my own relatives seemed wrong, almost like betrayal. Brittany was the wife of my only son, the mother of my future grandchildren. To suspect her of some evil intent would mean destroying the family harmony that I had so carefully preserved over the past few years. On the other hand, two identical cases of illness after her visits could not be a mere coincidence. My body was reacting to something specific, and I needed to find out what it was. After all, it was my health and safety at stake. If someone was really putting something in my food or drink, it had to be stopped immediately. By noon, I was finally ready to watch the recording. Settling into a chair with a cup of coffee and opening the app on my phone, I found the right time frame. The camera recorded the children arriving at 7 in the evening and their entire visit until they left at 10:30. The first half hour of the recording showed nothing unusual. We sat in the living room, drank tea, and talked about the security camera and recent events in the neighborhood. Jacob seemed relaxed and content, happily talking about his work. Brittany seemed a little tense, but I chalked it up to fatigue after a day at work. The interesting moments began when we moved to the dining room for dinner. The camera only captured part of the archway, leading from the living room to the kitchen, but that was enough to see our movements. After the main course, when it was time to serve dessert, I went to the kitchen to get the pie. The recording clearly shows Brittany getting up from the table and following me. Jacob remained in the dining room, continuing to tell a story about a colleague. For the next few minutes, the camera only captured his lone figure at the table, while my sister-in-law and I bustled about in the kitchen. I fast-forwarded the recording to the moment we returned to the living room for tea. Here we are sitting on the sofa and in armchairs, and I put the tray with the pie on the coffee table. Brittany neatly arranges the cups, and it is at this moment that I notice something strange. She placed my rose-patterned cup separately from the others, turning the handle slightly toward me. This gesture might have seemed like ordinary attentiveness, but my sister-in-law's expression made me suspicious. The recording clearly shows her glancing at my cup several times, as if checking something. When I pick up the cup and take my first sip, Brittany watches my reaction closely. The rest of the recording showed events I was already familiar with: conversations over tea, my trip to the kitchen for seconds, my return to the living room. But now I was looking at everything from a different angle, paying attention to details I had missed before. When I went to the kitchen for a second pot of tea, Brittany did indeed get up and go to the bookshelf. The recording clearly shows her looking not so much at the books and photographs as at the space around them. Her movements seemed purposeful, as if she were looking for something specific or assessing the layout of the room. Then my daughter-in-law moved to the coffee table with the documents. She didn't pick up the folder, but she was clearly studying what was visible through the transparent cover. Her face showed the concentration that people have when they are memorizing important information. All this happened in 3 or 4 minutes while I was busy with the kettle in the kitchen. The most interesting moment of the recording was at the end of the evening when Brittany asked to use the bathroom. The video clearly shows her leaving the living room toward the hallway, but almost immediately turning right into my bedroom instead of going straight to the bathroom. She spends about 2 minutes in the bedroom, then quickly goes to the bathroom. What could she have been doing in my bedroom for 2 minutes? Looking at the new curtains, as she later explained? But I didn't have any new curtains, and the old ones had been hanging there for over a year. The only thing that could have interested her in the bedroom was the bedside table with the medicines she had asked about in such detail at dinner. I paused the recording and thought about what I had seen. Brittany's behavior seemed suspicious, but there was no direct evidence of her guilt in my illness yet. The camera recorded strange actions, but not the moment when something was mixed into my tea. Perhaps it all happened in the kitchen, out of the view of the video surveillance. Nevertheless, what I saw made me seriously reconsider my attitude toward my sister-in-law. Her interest in my medications, documents, and personal belongings was clearly not accidental. She was definitely up to something, although it was not yet clear what. Simple curiosity did not explain such purposeful behavior. I decided to test my suspicions in a practical way. I went into the bedroom and carefully examined the bedside table. The medications were not quite as I had left them. One box had been turned upside down, and the lid of another had been slightly displaced. These were minor details that most people would not have noticed, but I was accustomed to perfect order. Among my medications were blood pressure pills, bone vitamins, and a mild sleeping pill that Dr. Wilson had prescribed for insomnia. It was the sleeping pill that could have caused the symptoms I was experiencing: drowsiness, sluggishness, and weakness the next day. But the box was almost full, with only 1 or 2 pills missing. However, I didn't remember the exact amount of medication. Perhaps Brittany really did take 1 or 2 sleeping pills, crush them, and mix them into my tea. That would explain my condition and the lack of any traces. A small dose of sleeping pills is not life-threatening, but it can seriously affect the well-being of an elderly person. But why would she need to do that? What was the point of poisoning her mother-in-law with mild sedatives? The only reasonable explanation that came to mind was related to my property. Perhaps Brittany wanted me to appear frail and infirm in Jacob's eyes, so that her son would start to worry about my health and offer to take custody of me. If my daughter-in-law systematically mixes sleeping pills into my food, over time this could lead to serious health problems. Constant drowsiness, forgetfulness, and impaired coordination are all characteristic signs of an overdose of sedatives. Those around me may mistake these symptoms for senile dementia or other age-related diseases. And then the standard scenario: a concerned son insists that his mother move to a nursing home or that guardianship be established. In any case, I would lose control of my property, and the young family would gain access to my savings and real estate. The plan seemed cynical but quite realistic. I returned to the living room and reviewed the key points of the recording once again. Now Brittany's behavior was seen in a completely different light. Her interest in medication was entirely practical. She needed to find out what drugs I was taking in order to choose the right ones for her purposes. Studying the documents also made sense. She was assessing the extent of my assets. Even visiting the bedroom under a false pretext now had a logical explanation. Brittany was checking where I kept my medications so she could access them in the future. Perhaps she was planning something more serious than occasionally mixing sleeping pills into my tea. But so far, these were only assumptions based on circumstantial evidence. The video recording captured suspicious behavior, but not the actual poisoning. To prove my case, I needed more solid evidence, and I decided to get it. The next family visit could be a test. If my suspicions are correct, Brittany will repeat her actions, and I will be ready for it. The camera will record everything that happens, and I will be as attentive as possible to what happens to my food and drinks. For now, I had to act normal and not reveal what I knew. If my sister-in-law realized that I suspected something, she might change her tactics or stop her actions altogether. I needed irrefutable evidence that I could present to Jacob or even the police. I spent the rest of the day thinking about what to do next. The situation turned out to be more complicated than it seemed at first. It wasn't enough to just stop eating and drinking in Brittany's presence. I needed to understand the scope of her plans and prevent possible consequences. In the evening, I carefully reviewed the entire recording of the children's visit once again. Every glance from my sister-in-law, every movement she made, now took on a sinister meaning. The woman I had considered simply cold and reserved turned out to be cunning and dangerous. And now I had to decide what to do with this knowledge. I spent the next few days deep in thought about what I had learned. Every morning, waking up in my bedroom, I looked at the bedside table with the medicines and realized how vulnerable I had been all this time. The person I trusted as a member of my family had systematically exploited my hospitality for some dark purpose. I tried to reconstruct the chronology of events over the past few months. Brittany became Jacob's wife 3 years ago, and at first our relationship was quite peaceful. She was reserved but polite, participated in family celebrations, and gave gifts for birthdays and Christmas. There were no serious conflicts between us. But if I think back carefully, the first strange things in her behavior appeared about 6 months ago. That's when she began to show increased interest in my health, asking about my well-being, medications, and visits to the doctor. At the time, it seemed like my daughter-in-law was just caring for her elderly mother-in-law. Now I realized that it was reconnaissance. Around the same time, Brittany began to stay in the kitchen more often after family dinners, offering to help with the dishes or cleaning. I gratefully accepted her help, not suspecting that she was using these moments to study the layout of the house, the location of important things, and my habits. The systematic ailments after their visits began about 2 months ago. I remember the first case well. At the time, I thought I had caught some kind of infection. The weakness lasted 3 days, but then everything returned to normal. The second episode occurred a month later, and now I knew the date of the third. It was the visit the day before yesterday. So Brittany was acting according to a specific plan, gradually increasing the dosage or changing the drugs. Perhaps at first she experimented, finding the optimal amount of sleeping pills that would cause the desired effect but not lead to serious consequences. Too strong a reaction could arouse suspicion or require a doctor to be called. I thought about my daughter-in-law's motives. Financial interest seemed the most likely explanation. My house in a good neighborhood of Buffalo was worth a lot, plus my savings from many years of working as a teacher and my late husband's savings. For a young couple, this was a significant amount of money that could radically change their standard of living. But to gain access to my property, Brittany would have to either wait for my death or have me declared incompetent. The first option could take many years, considering that I was in fairly good shape for my age. The second option seemed quicker and more practical. Systematic poisoning with small doses of sedatives could lead to a gradual deterioration of my mental state. Forgetfulness, confusion, and impaired coordination are all symptoms characteristic of an overdose of sleeping pills. If they became sufficiently pronounced, Jacob might begin to worry about my ability to live independently. The further scenario was predictable. A concerned son would insist on a medical examination, which would reveal cognitive impairment. Doctors would attribute this to age-related changes and recommend constant care. Jacob, urged on by his wife, would suggest arranging guardianship or placing me in a specialized facility. In any case, the young family would gain control over my finances and real estate, and I would end up as a helpless old woman, unable to manage my own life. The prospect was so terrifying that I felt a chill run down my spine. It was especially painful to realize that Jacob was most likely unaware of his wife's plans. My son had always been an honest and decent person. He would never have agreed to such a scheme. Brittany was acting behind his back, perhaps planning to present my deteriorating condition to him as a natural part of aging. I tried to remember if there had been any recent changes in my son's behavior. Indeed, 2 months ago, he began to ask about my health more often and offer to help with shopping and household chores. At the time, it seemed like normal concern, but now I realized that Brittany might have been hinting to him about my growing infirmity. You know, your mom has been acting strange lately. I think she's become more absent-minded. Isn't it time for her to get checked out? My daughter-in-law could well have uttered such phrases at home, gradually forming Jacob's opinion about the need for closer supervision of my life. The most cynical thing about this story was that Brittany used her son's natural love for his mother to achieve her own selfish goals. She turned Jacob's concern into a tool of manipulation, forcing him to unwittingly participate in his own betrayal. I got up from the chair and paced around the living room, trying to calm down. The camera in the corner quietly recorded my movements, just as it had recorded my daughter-in-law's criminal actions. It was a good thing I decided to install a video surveillance system. Without it, I would never have known the truth. Now I had to decide what to do with this information. I could tell Jacob everything right away, show him the recording, and demand an explanation from his wife. But my son might not believe me or might find other explanations for Brittany's behavior. Besides, the video recording did not contain direct evidence of poisoning, only suspicious actions. Another option was to go to the police with a statement about attempted poisoning. But here, too, the evidence base looked weak. The illness had already passed. I had not done any tests, and my daughter-in-law's strange behavior could be explained by ordinary curiosity. The police were unlikely to seriously investigate complaints from an elderly woman about her own relative. That left the third option: to obtain more serious evidence. Wait for the children's next visit. Be as attentive as possible and try to record the fact of poisoning. If Brittany really did put something in my tea or food, I would need to save samples for analysis. This option was risky, but the most promising. With the results of a chemical analysis confirming the presence of foreign substances in the drinks, it would be possible to bring serious charges against my daughter-in-law. Such evidence could not be disputed or explained away as a coincidence. I began to think through the details of the future operation. I would need to prepare several small containers for samples in advance and hide them in easily accessible places. During the visit, I would have to be extremely careful, pretend that I didn't suspect anything, but at the same time watch Brittany's every move. The most difficult part would be to discreetly take samples of tea or food after my sister-in-law had mixed something into them. I would have to distract her, leave the room under some pretext, and quickly transfer some of the contents into the container. Then I would have to pretend that nothing had happened and drink the poisoned beverage. The last thought made me shudder. Consciously eating poisoned food seemed insane. But how else could I prove my sister-in-law's malicious intent? If I refuse to eat or drink, she will realize that her plan has been exposed and change her tactics. And I needed irrefutable evidence. However, now that I knew about the sleeping pill, I could take some kind of antidote in advance, or at least minimize the dose. The main thing was to get a sample for analysis, not necessarily drink the whole cup. A few sips should be enough to be convincing. I spent the rest of the day planning my actions and preparing for my next meeting with Brittany. I had to think through every detail and anticipate possible scenarios. One mistake, and my sister-in-law would realize that her plans had been exposed. By evening, I had finally made up my mind to act. Too much was at stake. My freedom, my independence, control over my own life. Brittany threatened everything I valued, and I couldn't let her continue. Before going to bed, I reviewed the camera footage once more, studying my sister-in-law's tactics. Her actions were thoughtful and cautious, but not flawless. She counted on her victim's trust and carelessness, not expecting an elderly woman to be so observant. But I had lived 70 years, seen all kinds of people, and encountered betrayal and deception. Years of teaching school had taught me to understand human nature, to spot lies and hidden motives. Brittany underestimated her opponent, and that could be her fatal mistake. As I fell asleep, I thought about how my life had changed over the past week. Not long ago, I was an ordinary elderly woman whose main concerns were my health, my home, and the rare visits from my son. Now I had become a detective, unraveling a family conspiracy against my own life. Tomorrow I had to start preparing for the decisive battle with my daughter-in-law, and I was determined to win this battle, whatever the cost. The next morning, I woke up with the firm decision to act immediately. Waiting for Brittany's next visit was risky. Who knows what doses she might use next time, or whether she might change her tactics. I needed to obtain medical evidence that there were foreign substances in my body. The first thing I did was call Dr. Wilson's clinic and ask for an urgent appointment. The secretary said that the earliest available appointment was in a week, but I insisted that this was a serious health issue. After some negotiation, I was given an appointment for today at 2 o'clock. Dr. Wilson had been my family doctor for over 15 years. He was a man in his 60s, an experienced therapist with an impeccable reputation. He knew my entire medical history, the peculiarities of my body, and the list of medications I was taking. If anyone could figure out the situation, it was him. I had a few hours before my appointment, and I decided to spend them preparing. I needed to clearly articulate my suspicions without coming across as a paranoid old woman. Doctors are skeptical about complaints from elderly patients about poisoning by relatives. Too often, such accusations turn out to be a figment of the imagination or age-related mental disorders. I made a detailed list of the symptoms I had experienced after the last 2 visits from my children: unusual drowsiness, sluggish reactions, dizziness, muscle weakness, and impaired coordination. All of these symptoms were characteristic of an overdose of sedatives, which I discovered by studying medical websites on the internet. I also prepared a chronology of events, clearly linked to the dates of Brittany's visits. 2 months ago, I felt unwell for the first time after a family dinner, and it lasted for 3 days. A month ago, I had a second episode with the same symptoms, which lasted for 2 days. 4 days ago, the third episode, with more severe symptoms, took 3 days to recover from. To this list, I added a description of my daughter-in-law's strange behavior, increased interest in my medications, examining documents, unauthorized visits to the bedroom. All of this should have given Dr. Wilson a complete picture of what was happening. Before leaving the house, I carefully examined the bedside table once more. The number of sleeping pills had indeed decreased. There were fewer in the box than there should have been if taken regularly according to the instructions. The difference was small, only 2 or 3 pills, but that would be enough for several cases of poisoning in small doses. Dr. Wilson's clinic was located in a modern medical center, 10 minutes drive from my home. I took a taxi because I didn't feel like driving after my recent illness. I had to wait about 20 minutes in the reception area. The doctor had a busy schedule, but he always found time for patients with urgent problems. Michelle, how are you? Dr. Wilson got up from his desk to greet me. What brings you to me so urgently? I sat down in a comfortable chair across from his desk and took out the notes I had prepared. I decided to start with the most important thing, without wasting time on preliminary explanations. Doctor, I suspect that someone is putting sedatives in my food or drinks. It's happened 3 times in the last 2 months, and each time after visits from a certain person. Wilson raised his eyebrows, but his expression remained professionally neutral. Over the years of practice, he had probably heard all kinds of stories from patients. Tell me more about the symptoms you've been experiencing. I read out the list I had compiled, describing each episode of illness in detail. The doctor listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the duration of the symptoms, their intensity, and the circumstances in which they occurred. What makes you think it's poisoning? He asked when I finished. Such symptoms can occur for many reasons: stress, fatigue, changes in diet, drug interactions. I have reason to suspect a specific person, I replied, and told him about Brittany's behavior and showed him the photos from the surveillance camera on my phone. Dr. Wilson carefully studied the footage of my sister-in-law, rummaging through documents and entering my bedroom without permission. His expression gradually became more serious. I understand your concern. The behavior does seem suspicious. But to confirm poisoning, we need laboratory tests. The problem is that sedatives are eliminated from the body fairly quickly. How long do they remain in the blood or urine? Most sleeping pills and tranquilizers are completely eliminated within 2 to 3 days. Your last episode was 4 days ago, so traces may no longer be detectable, but we'll try. The doctor wrote referrals for blood and urine tests with extended toxicological screening. Particular attention had to be paid to the presence of benzodiazepines, barbiturates, and other sedatives. The tests could be taken right at the clinic, and the results would be ready in 2 days. If the suspicions are confirmed, what do you advise me to do? I asked. First of all, ensure your safety. Do not stay alone with the suspect. Do not accept food or drinks from them. Then decide on the matter with the involvement of law enforcement agencies. The testing procedure took about an hour. The lab technician took blood from my vein and asked me to provide a urine sample in a special container. I honestly warned her that the last time I had eaten suspicious food was 4 days ago, and she assured me that some substances can remain in the body for up to a week. Leaving the clinic, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, I had finally taken concrete steps to solve the problem. On the other hand, I had to wait for the results, which could either confirm my suspicions or prove them unfounded. I spent the rest of the day at home, thinking about what to do next, depending on the test results. If the toxicology test did not reveal any foreign substances, I would have to find other ways to prove Brittany's guilt. Perhaps I would install additional cameras in the kitchen or bedroom. If the tests confirmed the presence of sedatives in my system, the situation would change dramatically. Then I would have medical evidence of poisoning that I could present to both my son and the police. The next 2 days dragged on painfully. I tried to go about my usual business, but my thoughts kept returning to the upcoming results. Several times I wanted to call the lab and ask if the tests were ready ahead of schedule, but I held back. On Wednesday morning, exactly 48 hours after the tests were taken, Dr. Wilson called me. From the tone of his voice, I knew immediately that the news was serious. Michelle, you need to come to the clinic right away. The test results are ready, and we have something to discuss. Bad news? More like confirmation of your suspicions. Come when you can. I'll make time for you. An hour later, I was sitting in the familiar office, and Dr. Wilson was studying the printout of the test results. His face was concerned and serious, which foreshadowed unpleasant revelations. The toxicology analysis revealed traces of zolpidem in your blood and urine. It's a sleeping pill from the non-benzodiazepine group. The concentration is low, but sufficient to explain the symptoms you described. Zolpidem? But I don't take that. That's exactly why the result is alarming. This drug is not on your prescription list. Moreover, traces were found in both your blood and urine, which indicates that you have been taking it for the last 3 to 4 days. The doctor showed me a line in the analysis that listed the name of the substance and its concentration. The numbers meant nothing to me, but the seriousness of the situation was obvious. What conclusion can be drawn from this data? The conclusion is clear. A drug that you did not consciously take has entered your body. Given the circumstances and your suspicions, it looks like deliberate poisoning. Hearing these words, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and horror. On the one hand, my suspicions had been scientifically confirmed. On the other hand, it was now clear that Brittany had indeed tried to harm me. Is this drug dangerous? Can such doses be harmful to health? Zolpidem is relatively safe in therapeutic doses, but even small amounts can cause serious side effects in older people. Falls due to impaired coordination, confusion, respiratory depression. With regular use, cumulative effects are possible. The doctor explained that zolpidem is a modern sleeping pill that is often prescribed for insomnia. The drug is effective but requires caution in use, especially in people over the age of 70. Overdose can lead to coma and respiratory arrest. The most dangerous thing in your situation is that the dosage was determined by trial and error, Wilson continued. The person who did this had no medical knowledge and could easily have made a mistake with the amount. We discussed further action. The doctor strongly recommended that we report the attempted poisoning to the police. The test results were sufficient grounds for initiating a criminal case. What about family relations? After all, we are talking about my son's wife. Michelle, I understand that this is difficult, but the person who systematically mixes sleeping pills into your food poses a real threat to your life. The doses may increase each time. Sooner or later, it could end in tragedy. The doctor gave me a report with the test results and a detailed conclusion about the violations that had been identified. The document was on the clinic's official letterhead, stamped and signed by the doctor. It was irrefutable proof of poisoning. As I left the clinic, I thought about how my life had changed over the past week. Not long ago, the main problem was burglaries in the neighborhood and the need to install a security camera. Now I was holding medical evidence that my own sister-in-law had tried to poison me. The most painful thing was the realization that the family idol I had cherished so much was an illusion. The woman I had welcomed into my home as a daughter actually saw me as an obstacle to her path to wealth. The cynicism of her actions was even more shocking than the fact of the poisoning itself. At home, I sat down in an armchair with the documents from the clinic and reread Dr. Wilson's conclusion. Everything was stated very clearly. Traces of a drug I had not taken were found in my body. The concentration indicated that it had been taken in the last few days, and the symptoms corresponded to poisoning with this substance. Now I had to decide what to do with this information. I could go straight to the police and file a report against Brittany. I could talk to Jacob first, show him the evidence, and demand an explanation from his wife. Or I could try to get even more convincing evidence by recording the moment of poisoning. Each option had its pros and cons. Going to the police would guarantee an official investigation, but it could ruin my relationship with my son. Talking to Jacob would be more delicate, but it could warn Brittany of the danger. Trying to get additional evidence was risky, but it could provide irrefutable proof. I decided not to rush into a final decision. I already had the medical evidence, and it wasn't going anywhere. I could spend another day or two thinking about the best strategy. The main thing was to no longer put myself in danger, to avoid situations in which Brittany could repeat her actions. In the evening, I called Jacob to find out his plans for the next few days. I needed to make sure he wasn't planning on visiting with his wife anytime soon. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" My son's voice sounded normal, no suspicion or concern. "I'm fine, son. I just wanted to know if you were planning on coming over this weekend." "No specific plans yet. Brittany has a lot of work, some kind of backlog. Maybe we'll go next week." "Okay. How is she feeling? Not sick?" "No, she's fine. Why, did she look bad last time?" "Just asking. Say hi to her for me." After the conversation, I realized that I had a few days to make a decision. Brittany is busy at work, so unplanned visits are unlikely. I can calmly think about the situation and choose the best course of action. As I fell asleep, I thought about how tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new phase in this strange story. The medical evidence had been obtained, the identity of the poisoner had been established, and all that remained was to decide how to use this information. And I was determined to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. The next day, I woke up with the feeling that the time had come to make a decision. The medical evidence lay on the coffee table in the living room, reminding me of the seriousness of the situation. There was no point in putting off the conversation with my son any longer. The sooner Jacob learned the truth about his wife, the better for everyone. I spent the morning mentally rehearsing the upcoming conversation. How to begin? How could she explain to her son that the woman he loved and had been living with for 3 years was systematically poisoning his mother? How could she convince him of the seriousness of the situation without coming across as a paranoid old woman? The most difficult part would be overcoming her son's natural distrust of such accusations. Jacob sees Brittany every day, sleeps in the same bed with her, and makes plans for the future. To him, she is a loving wife, not a cold-blooded poisoner. Breaking these illusions will be painful. Around noon, I dialed my son's number. My heart was beating faster than usual. This was perhaps the most important conversation of my life. Not only my future, but also my safety and family relationships depended on how it went. "Hi, Mom," Jacob answered after the third ring. "What's wrong? You rarely call during work hours." "Son, I need to have a serious talk with you. Can you spare a few minutes?" "Sure. Did something happen? Are you sick?" I took a deep breath, preparing to say the words that would change his life. "Jacob, your wife is dangerous. She's trying to hurt me." There was silence on the other end of the line. All I could hear was the background noise of the office, the tapping of keyboards, the muffled voices of colleagues. Jacob clearly wasn't expecting to hear something like this. "Mom, what do you mean? What are you talking about?" "Brittany is putting sleeping pills in my food." "I have medical proof." Wait. Let's take this one step at a time. Are you accusing my wife of trying to poison you? Seriously?" I heard a mixture of bewilderment, irritation, and concern for my mental state in my son's voice. That was exactly the reaction I feared most. I understand how this sounds, but hear me out. For the past 2 months after each of your visits, I've had a strange feeling of malaise. I had tests done, and they showed traces of a sleeping pill in my blood that I don't take. Maybe it's a lab error or an interaction with your medications. "No, Jacob, I consulted with Dr. Wilson. He confirmed that it was poisoning from an unknown drug. I told my son in detail about my observations. Brittany's strange behavior during her last visit, her interest in my medications and documents, her unauthorized visit to my bedroom. I described the symptoms of illness, which corresponded exactly to poisoning with sleeping pills. Mom, listen to yourself, Jacob said when I finished. You're accusing my wife of attempted murder based on the fact that she was interested in your medications and entered your bedroom. Not murder, but systematic poisoning with the aim of undermining my mental health. Why would she need that? What's the point? Your inheritance, Jacob, my house, my savings. If I'm declared incapacitated, you'll get guardianship and control over the property. My son was silent for a long time, digesting what he had heard. I imagined him sitting in his office, trying to reconcile the image of his beloved wife with that of a cold-blooded poisoner. Mom, I understand that you've been worried about the break-ins in the neighborhood lately. Stress can affect your health and cause paranoia. Maybe you should see a psychologist? This phrase hurt my pride. My son assumed that the problem was my mental state, not his wife's criminal actions. But I understood his position. It was really hard to believe such a story. Jacob, I have a report from the clinic with the test results. It says in black and white that a sleeping pill was found in my blood. This is not paranoia, but a medical fact. Okay, let's say the tests are correct, but that doesn't prove Brittany's guilt. Maybe it was a mistake at the pharmacy, the wrong medication dispensed, or someone else's pills accidentally ending up in my blood. I understood that my son was clinging to any alternative explanation so as not to believe the worst. It's a normal human reaction to protect loved ones from serious accusations. I have a video recording from a surveillance camera, I said. It shows Brittany acting suspiciously during your last visit. What recording? Are you watching us? I installed the camera to protect against burglars, but it accidentally recorded your wife's behavior. I described the key moments in the recording, how Brittany studied my documents, rummaged through the bedroom, and behaved strangely in the kitchen. But even these details did not convince Jacob of his wife's guilt. Mom, do you realize how serious these accusations are? If this becomes known, our family will be destroyed. Think about it. Maybe you're wrong. I've been thinking about it for 3 days. I checked and double-checked all the facts. Jacob, I don't want to destroy your family, but I can't keep quiet when it comes to my safety. The conversation reached an impasse. My son refused to even consider the possibility that Brittany was guilty, and I couldn't convince him of the seriousness of the threat. A wall of misunderstanding and mutual accusations had grown between us. You know what? Jacob said after a long pause. Let's meet tonight. We'll talk calmly, look at these tests and the recording. Maybe together we can figure out the situation. Are you coming alone? Yes, Brittany is working late today. I'll be at your place at 7. After the conversation ended, I felt a mixture of disappointment and hope. On the one hand, my son didn't believe my words, which was painful. On the other hand, he agreed to meet and listen to the evidence, which gave me a chance to change his mind. I spent the rest of the day preparing for the evening meeting. I laid out the clinic report on the table, set up the camera to show the recording of the last visit, and compiled a chronology of events. I needed to present the information as convincingly as possible, relying on facts rather than emotions. Jacob arrived at 7 sharp, as promised. He looked tired and tense. Obviously, he had spent the day thinking about our conversation. We hugged when we met, but his embrace felt restrained. Mom, show me your evidence, he said, settling into a chair. I want to understand everything. I started with the medical records. I showed him Dr. Wilson's report and explained the significance of the substances found in the tests. Jacob studied the papers carefully, asking questions about the testing procedure and the reliability of the results. Zolpidem, he read the name of the drug. Never heard of it. Are you sure you didn't take it? Absolutely sure. Dr. Wilson confirmed that this medication is not among my prescriptions. Then we moved on to watching the video recording. I showed my son the key moments, how Brittany studied the documents, went into the bedroom, and behaved strangely in the kitchen. Jacob's face showed the struggle between his desire to protect his wife and his growing doubts about her innocence. I admit it looks suspicious, he said after watching, but that's still not direct evidence of poisoning. What do you think would be direct evidence? A video of her putting pills in my tea? Well, at least some evidence in her belongings. Or a confession. I realized that my son was willing to cling to any doubts just so he wouldn't have to believe his wife was guilty. It was understandable from a human point of view, but extremely dangerous for me. Jacob, what if I'm right? What if Brittany is really trying to hurt me? Are you willing to risk my life to preserve your illusions about your marriage? This question made him think. I saw an internal struggle in his eyes between love for his wife and concern for his mother. Okay, he finally said. Let's say your suspicions are not unfounded. What do you suggest we do? Talk to Brittany, show her these test results, and ask if she knows anything about this drug. What if she denies everything? Then I'll have to go to the police. Jacob paled at the mention of the police. He had obviously only now realized the seriousness of the situation and the possible consequences for his family. Mom, let's not rush into extreme measures. Give me a few days to talk to my wife and figure out the situation. What if she tries to poison him again during those few days? I'll keep an eye on it. Anyway, we won't come to visit you until we find out the truth. It was a reasonable decision, albeit a painful one. By agreeing to such precautions, my son was effectively acknowledging the possibility of his wife's guilt. Are there any other suspicious aspects of Brittany's behavior? Jacob asked. Anything you hadn't noticed before or hadn't thought was important? I told him about my daughter-in-law's increased interest in my health in recent months, her questions about medications and doctor's visits. I also mentioned how she had started staying in the kitchen after dinner more often, offering to help with the cleaning. All of that can be explained by normal concern for her mother-in-law, my son remarked. It could be, but in the context of the sleeping pills found in her blood, this concern looks different. We talked for another hour, discussing the details and possible scenarios. Jacob gradually came to the conclusion that my suspicions might be justified, although he still hoped his wife was innocent. Promise me one thing, he said before leaving. Don't take any action until we talk again. Give me time to figure things out with Brittany. How much time do you need? A week, 10 days, max. Okay, but if anything happens during that time, if she tries to poison him again, I'll go straight to the police. Jacob agreed to these terms. We said goodbye quietly. There was now a heavy secret between us that affected all our relationships. Left alone, I tried to analyze the results of the conversation. My son didn't believe me completely, but he didn't dismiss the accusations either. He agreed to investigate the situation, which was the best outcome I could hope for. Now I had to wait and hope that Jacob would be able to find out the truth about his wife. If Brittany was indeed guilty, sooner or later she would slip up or make a mistake. If my suspicions turned out to be false, then I would have to look for other explanations for the strange test results. In any case, I had taken the first and most important step. I had warned my son about the danger. Now he knew about the situation and could take measures to protect both me and himself. Only time would tell what would happen next. Before going to bed, I checked the locks on the doors again and made sure the camera was working properly. The next week promised to be tense and unpredictable, but I was ready for any turn of events. The week of waiting stretched out like a month. Every day I hoped for a call from Jacob with explanations or apologies from Brittany. But the days passed in silence, and that silence became increasingly eloquent. Obviously, my son's conversation with his wife had not brought the desired results. On the fourth day of waiting, I couldn't take it anymore and called Jacob myself. He didn't answer right away, and when he picked up the phone, his voice sounded tense and formal. "Mom, I was just about to call you." "Well, did you manage to talk to Brittany?" "Yes, I did. She categorically denies any attempts to harm you. She says you misinterpreted her behavior." "How does she explain the test results?" "She thinks it's a laboratory error or a mix-up with the medications. She suggests you see another doctor for a second opinion." I heard something more than just a retelling of his wife's words in my son's voice. I could sense that he himself was not entirely convinced by her explanations, but continued to defend her out of loyalty to their marriage. "Jacob, what do you think? Do you believe her?" The long pause spoke louder than any words. My son was clearly doubtful, but didn't want to admit it even to himself. "I don't know what to think, Mom. On the one hand, you have medical evidence. On the other hand, I can't believe that the woman I live with is capable of such a thing. What if we test her, invite us both to a family dinner, and see how she behaves?" "No," Jacob replied sharply. "I'm not going to provoke my own family, and I'm not going to put you at risk if your suspicions are correct." This reaction finally convinced me that my son understood the reality of the threat deep down. He wasn't ready to openly admit his wife's guilt, but he didn't want to risk my safety either. "Then what do you suggest?" "Let's wait a little longer. Maybe the situation will clear up on its own." "How long should we wait? A month? A year? Until your wife finishes what she started?" "Mom, don't say that. I'm working on it." But his words sounded unconvincing. I understood that Jacob was in an unbearable situation. He had to choose between his wife and his mother, between family happiness and justice. Such a choice could break anyone. After talking to my son, I made my final decision. Waiting any longer was pointless and dangerous. Brittany knew about my suspicions and could change her tactics or try to cause more serious harm. To delay would be to expose myself to unnecessary risk. The next day, I went to the police station, taking with me all the evidence I had gathered: a report from the clinic with the test results, a video recording from the surveillance camera, and a chronology of events. The time for half measures was over. Decisive action was needed. The officer on duty, a young man in his 30s, was initially skeptical about my statement. Apparently, complaints from elderly people about their relatives were quite common in their practice. But when I showed him the medical documents, his attitude changed. "Wait here, I'll call a detective who specializes in cases like this." Half an hour later, I was sitting in the office of Detective Sandra Coleman, a middle-aged woman with attentive eyes and a professional demeanor. She listened to my story, carefully studied the documents, and reviewed key excerpts from the video recording. "Cases of poisoning within the family are not uncommon," Detective Coleman said. "Usually the motive is inheritance or insurance. Do you have a will?" "Yes, all the property is bequeathed to my son, but he knows about it and has never shown any greed." "What about his wife? Does she know about the will?" "I think so. It wasn't a secret." The detective nodded, making notes in her notebook. She was obviously familiar with the pattern. A young wife pushes her husband to get his inheritance by using various methods to pressure his elderly relatives. "The medical evidence looks convincing," Coleman continued. "Zolpidem is a serious drug. An overdose can be fatal. The video recording is also interesting, albeit indirect. Is this enough to open a case?" "I think so, but first we need to conduct a more detailed investigation, question the suspect, and possibly search her home." The detective explained the procedure for further action to me. First, Brittany would be called in for questioning as a witness, and they would try to get an explanation from her for her strange behavior. If she is unable to provide convincing answers, she may be detained for further questioning. Keep in mind that the investigation could seriously affect your family relationships, Coleman warned. Your son is unlikely to forgive you for having his mother arrested, even if she turns out to be guilty. I understand, but I can't risk my life for the sake of family harmony. That same day, Detective Coleman contacted Brittany and summoned her to the station the next morning. My sister-in-law was told that it was a routine interview in connection with a complaint of poisoning, without specifying who had filed it. I spent a sleepless night imagining how the interrogation was going, what Brittany was answering to uncomfortable questions. In the morning, Detective Coleman called me with the first results. Your sister-in-law is acting very nervous. She's confused in her testimony and gives contradictory explanations for her behavior during her visit to you. She denies knowing about zolpidem, but we checked and this drug was prescribed to her 3 months ago for insomnia. So she lied about not knowing about this drug? It appears so. Plus, we found an interesting detail in her medical records. She consulted a psychiatrist about obsessive thoughts about money and inheritance. The doctor recommended therapy, but she refused treatment. This information confirmed my worst suspicions. Not only did Brittany have access to the drugs she needed, but she also suffered from pathological greed, which drove her to commit the crime. What's next? We got a search warrant for her house. If we find your medication there or traces of drugs she may have used, we'll arrest her. The search took place in the afternoon. Detective Coleman called me in the evening with the results. We found some interesting things. First, there were 2 Zolpidem pills in her makeup bag in an unlabeled bag, clearly prepared for use. Second, they found notes in her notebook about your medications and how to take them. Most importantly, they found a garlic press in the kitchen with traces of crushed pills. The evidence was irrefutable. Brittany wasn't just planning the poisoning, she was already preparing for the next stage. The garlic press with traces of medication showed that she had been crushing the pills into powder to mix into drinks. We arrested her on charges of attempted poisoning and attempted grievous bodily harm. The preliminary hearing will be held tomorrow morning. After the conversation ended, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. On the one hand, the threat had been eliminated. Justice had prevailed. On the other hand, my family was destroyed, and my relationship with my only son was perhaps ruined forever. Jacob called me late in the evening. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been crying or screaming a lot. How could you, Mom? How could you go to the police without warning me? I gave you a week to deal with the situation. You did nothing. I was trying to find a compromise, and you destroyed my family. Your wife tried to kill me, Jacob. Isn't that more important than family harmony? We don't know if she's guilty yet. Maybe it's all a misunderstanding. But his words sounded unconvincing even to himself. The results of the search were too obvious to be explained away as a coincidence. Son, I understand how much this hurts you, but I couldn't keep quiet knowing the truth. What truth? You destroyed an innocent person's life based on suspicions. Then explain the drugs found in her home and the notes about my medications. Jacob couldn't answer that question. We both understood that the evidence was too serious to be disputed. I can't forgive you, Mom. You betrayed our family. And your wife didn't betray you by trying to poison your mother? That's different. She's sick. She needs help, not prison. Maybe, but she'll get help under the supervision of specialists, not by putting poison in someone else's food. The conversation ended with mutual recriminations. Jacob hung up, promising that he didn't want to talk to me anymore. It hurt, but I understood his reaction. Losing his wife and family happiness in an instant was a blow that was difficult to cope with. Brittany's trial took place a month later. Detective Coleman warned me that I would have to testify as a victim. It was a difficult ordeal to look into the eyes of a woman who had pretended to be a member of my family for 3 years, while in reality, she was planning my death. Brittany looked pale and depressed in court. Her lawyer tried to present the case as a misunderstanding, the result of mental illness, but the evidence was too convincing. The court sentenced her to 3 years probation with mandatory psychiatric treatment. After the trial, I met Jacob in the hallway of the building. He looked older and more exhausted than he had a month ago. We stood facing each other, not knowing what to say. Mom, he finally said in a quiet voice, I understand that you were right, but I can't forget that you ruined my life. I didn't ruin it, Jacob. Your wife did that herself when she decided to hurt me. Maybe, but I need time to come to terms with it. We said goodbye quietly, and he left. We haven't spoken since. Sometimes I heard about his life through mutual friends. He filed for divorce, moved to another city, started a new life. Maybe someday he'll understand that I did the right thing by protecting myself and him from a dangerous woman. 6 months have passed since Brittany's arrest. I continue to live alone in my house in Buffalo, enjoying the peace and security. The camera in the living room still records my normal life, but now it serves simply as a precaution against burglars, not as a means of protection from relatives. Sometimes I think about how my life might have turned out if I hadn't installed the video surveillance system. Brittany would probably have continued her poisoning experiments, gradually increasing the doses. Sooner or later, this would have led to tragedy, and my death would have been attributed to age and illness. But fate decided otherwise. A simple desire to protect my home from burglars led to the discovery of a family conspiracy. The technology that I was initially afraid to learn ended up saving my life. My neighbor Dorothy sometimes comes over for tea and to chat about life. She considers me a heroine who was able to stand up for herself in a difficult situation. Maybe she's right. I defended my independence and dignity by not letting anyone else decide how I should live and when I should die. The price was high. I lost my son and my family's happiness, but the alternative was losing my life or my sanity. It was a difficult choice, but it was the right one, and I don't regret my decision. In the evening, sitting in my armchair with a cup of tea, I sometimes look at the camera in the corner and smile. The little black dot that seemed like an invasion of my privacy turned out to be a reliable guardian. And as long as I can defend my home and dignity myself, no one will make me give up.